Ruby Mae Thompson froze mid-step on the mountain trail, her hiking stick trembling in her weathered hand as she watched the massive grizzly bear drag something heavy through the morning mist. The canvas bundle wasn't a stolen camping bag or hunter's gear. It was moving, whimpering, alive. When the bear stopped and gently released her grip, a tiny bear cub tumbled out, his fur matted with blood, one small paw twisted at an unnatural angle. Ruby's breath caught in her throat, 40 years of nursing instinct screaming that this baby was dying. The mother bear looked directly at Ruby, then took 3 deliberate steps backward, not retreating, but waiting. Her dark eyes held something Ruby had seen countless times in hospital corridors, a mother's desperate plea for help. Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the impossible truth. This wild creature had brought her dying child to a human stranger, betting everything on the kindness of someone she'd never met. What had driven a mother to such desperation? And could one forgotten widow possibly save them both? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Ruby Mae Thompson had been 73 years old for exactly 4 months and 16 days when she first questioned whether God had forgotten her address. The small cabin tucked between towering pines in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee had been home for 3 years now, ever since Earl passed and the kids decided she was too isolated in their old farmhouse. Too isolated, as if loneliness cared about geography. The morning routine never changed. Coffee in Earl's favorite mug, 2 pieces of toast she'd only half finished, and the long walk to his grave marker just beyond the tree line. She'd talk to him about the weather, the neighbors, the way the creek sounded different each season. What she didn't tell him was how the silence afterward felt like drowning. At 67, Ruby carried herself with the careful posture of someone who'd spent 4 decades on her feet in hospital corridors, healing bodies and holding hands through last breaths. Her silver hair was always pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn through countless 12-hour shifts. Her hands, once steady enough to thread the tiniest sutures, now trembled slightly when she reached for things, a reminder that time was no respecter of experience. The children called once a week, dutiful but distant. Sarah in California with her tech job and no time for visits. Michael in Florida with his new wife who found mountain folk quaint. They loved her, she knew, but love and presence weren't the same thing. Earl used to say she had enough heart for 3 people. Now she wondered if having a big heart in an empty house was more curse than blessing. This particular morning had started like any other. Coffee, toast, the familiar walk through dew-heavy grass toward Earl's marker. She'd chosen the hiking trail behind the cemetery, the one that wound up toward Cataract Falls, because 43 years of marriage had taught her that Earl always loved the sound of moving water. The trail was steep enough to remind her legs they still worked, gentle enough not to humble her pride. Ruby had been a trauma nurse at Vanderbilt for most of her career, then spent her final years as a wilderness medical volunteer, treating injured hikers and the occasional wildlife emergency. She'd stitched up everything from raccoon bites to bear encounters, always believing that healing was healing, regardless of species. Earl used to joke that she'd bandage a broken-winged butterfly if she could figure out how. But retirement had stolen that purpose. No more emergencies to solve, no more lives depending on her quick thinking and steady hands. The most medical excitement she'd had in 3 years was treating her neighbor's cat for a scratch, Mrs. Henderson's tabby hardly counted as a life-or-death situation. That's why, when she first spotted the enormous grizzly bear through the morning mist, dragging what looked like a heavy bundle across the trail ahead, Ruby's first thought wasn't fear, it was curiosity. After 40 years of medical training, she'd learned to look closer when something seemed wrong. She had no idea this moment would change everything. The bear cub's labored breathing cut through Ruby like a scalpel. She'd heard that sound before, in pediatric wards, in emergency rooms, in all the places where small bodies fought battles too big for them. This wasn't just injury. This was a life slipping away while she stood frozen like a tourist with a camera. Ruby dropped to her knees beside the torn canvas bag, her nursing instincts overriding 40 years of common sense about wild animals. The cub couldn't have been more than 4 months old, his dark fur matted with dried blood around a cruel steel trap that had mangled his left hind paw. Someone had tried to pry the trap open, probably the mother, but the damage was severe. Without immediate medical attention, infection would kill him within days. "Oh, honey," Ruby whispered, her voice cracking. "What did they do to you?" The mother bear hadn't moved. She sat 30 feet away, massive shoulders heaving, watching Ruby with an intensity that should have been terrifying. But Ruby recognized something in those dark eyes. The same desperate hope she'd seen in countless mothers' faces when their children lay broken on gurneys. This wasn't a predator. This was a mother who had exhausted every option except faith in a stranger's kindness. Ruby's hands moved automatically, checking the cub's vitals the way she'd checked thousands of patients. Pulse rapid but steady, breathing shallow, temperature elevated. Infection was already setting in. The trap had crushed bone, torn muscle, severed what looked like a major blood vessel that had somehow clotted enough to prevent him from bleeding out. "I need supplies," she murmured to herself, then louder, as if the mother bear might understand. "I need to get him help." The trek back to her cabin took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Ruby wrapped the cub in her jacket, surprised by how light he felt, how completely he trusted her despite his pain. Every few minutes she'd check his breathing, her own heart hammering with the familiar rhythm of emergency medicine. Her cabin's guest bedroom became a makeshift veterinary clinic. Ruby spread clean towels on the bed, started a fire to warm the room, and inventoried her supplies. Leftover antibiotics from her own recent sinus infection, gauze and medical tape from her first aid kit, Earl's old heating pad, a bottle of infant Tylenol that had expired 2 years ago but might help with pain management. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. The cub's eyes fluttered open as Ruby cleaned the wound with warm water. He didn't fight her, didn't snap or claw, just whimpered with the same trusting helplessness of every human child she'd ever treated. Ruby found herself humming an old lullaby she used to sing to her own babies, her fingers working as gently as possible around destroyed tissue. "Shh, little one," she whispered. "I've got you now." That's when she heard the truck. Ruby peered through her front window to see a battered Ford pickup pulling into her gravel driveway. A man climbed out, tall, weathered, wearing the kind of field clothes that suggested he belonged in these mountains. He carried a large duffel bag and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to emergencies. "Ma'am," he called, knocking on her front door. "I'm Calvin Whitmore. I work with wildlife rehabilitation. Someone reported seeing an injured bear cub in this area." Ruby's breath caught. How could anyone have reported anything? She'd been alone on that trail. But relief flooded through her as she opened the door to find a man who looked exactly like what she needed. Professional, prepared, competent. Calvin was perhaps 50, with graying hair and kind eyes that immediately focused on the sounds coming from her guest room. "Is that him? The cub?" "Yes," Ruby said, stepping aside to let him in. "He's badly injured. Steel trap." "I've done what I can, but—" "You did exactly right," Calvin interrupted, pulling surgical gloves from his bag. "May I?" Ruby led him to the guest room, where Calvin immediately began a thorough examination of the cub. His movements were confident, professional. He had real veterinary supplies, IV fluids, antibiotics, surgical instruments Ruby recognized from her hospital days. "This is severe," Calvin said quietly, "but treatable. You probably saved his life by getting him warm and stable." He looked up at Ruby with what seemed like genuine admiration. Not many people would know what to do. "I was a nurse," Ruby explained. 40 years at Vanderbilt, then Wilderness Medical. It shows. Calvin was already preparing an IV line. This little guy is lucky you found him. As Ruby watched Calvin work with obvious expertise, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the satisfaction of being useful again. The cub was going to live. She'd made a difference. She had no idea that everything Calvin had told her was a lie. Calvin's hands were too steady. That was the first thing that nagged at Ruby as she watched him work on the bear cub the next morning. In 40 years of medicine, she'd learned to read competence, and Calvin moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this exact procedure many times before. Too many times for a simple wildlife rehabilitator. "Where exactly is your facility?" Ruby asked, refilling the cub's water bowl. The little one had made it through the night, thanks to Calvin's IV antibiotics and pain medication. He was alert now, those dark eyes tracking Ruby's movements with growing trust. "About 30 miles north," Calvin replied without looking up from his medical bag. "We specialize in bear rehabilitation. This little guy will need at least 6 months of intensive care before he's ready for release." 6 months. The words hit Ruby like a diagnosis she didn't want to hear. She'd known this moment would come, when the cub would have to leave, when her purpose would disappear again, but she hadn't expected it to feel like losing another family member. "Could I visit him?" The question sounded pathetic even to her own ears. A lonely old woman begging to see a wild animal she'd known for barely 24 hours. Calvin's pause lasted a beat too long. "Our insurance doesn't allow civilian visitors. Liability issues, you understand." Ruby understood more than Calvin realized. She understood the sound of someone reciting a practiced lie. She understood the way his eyes shifted when he mentioned his facility. Most importantly, she understood that in 40 years of wilderness medical work, she'd never heard of a bear rehabilitation center 30 miles north of her location. "What's the name of your organization?" Ruby asked casually, stroking the cub's uninjured ear. "I'd like to make a donation." "Mountain Wildlife Recovery," Calvin said quickly. Too quickly. "We're fairly new. Still getting our nonprofit status finalized." The cub nuzzled against Ruby's palm, making a soft rumbling sound that vibrated through her fingers. Earl used to say she could read people like medical charts, and right now Calvin's chart was showing elevated heart rate, increased perspiration, and the telltale signs of someone working very hard to appear calm. "I've been thinking," Calvin continued, packing his supplies with unnecessary efficiency, "we should probably transfer him today. The sooner he gets to our facility, the better his chances." "Today?" Ruby's hand instinctively moved to protect the cub. "But he just stabilized. Shouldn't we wait another day or two?" "Time is critical with wildlife rehabilitation," Calvin said, his tone taking on a professional authority that felt rehearsed. "Every day in human contact makes eventual release more difficult." Ruby had heard that argument before, and it was true, to a point. But this cub wasn't becoming domesticated, he was becoming trusting. There was a difference, though Calvin seemed determined to ignore it. "Let me gather some supplies for the trip," Ruby said, stepping toward her kitchen. "Formula, blankets—" "That won't be necessary," Calvin interrupted. "We have everything we need." Through her kitchen window, Ruby could see Calvin's truck more clearly in the morning light. The vehicle was pristine, too pristine for someone who regularly transported wild animals. No scratches, no mud, no wear pattern she'd expect from wilderness work. The license plate was from out of state, which meant nothing, but the expensive veterinary equipment in the back suggested resources that seemed inconsistent with a small, new non-profit. More troubling was what she didn't see. No organization logos, no contact information, no visible permits or certifications that legitimate wildlife facilities were required to display. Ruby's phone had 1 bar of signal, barely enough for a quick internet search. Mountain Wildlife Recovery returned no results. No website, no state registrations, no mention in any wildlife rehabilitation databases. Her blood went cold. "Calvin," she called, returning to the guest room where he was preparing a transport carrier. "I can't find any information about your organization online." Calvin's hands stilled for just a moment, the pause of someone whose story had just hit a wall. "Like I said, we're new. Our web presence is still being developed. What's your state permit number?" "I don't have it memorized," Calvin said, not meeting her eyes. "It's back at the facility." Ruby felt the familiar surge of adrenaline she'd experienced countless times in emergency rooms when a patient's condition suddenly deteriorated. Something was very wrong, and every instinct she'd developed over 4 decades of reading crisis situations was screaming danger. "I think we should wait," Ruby said carefully. "Maybe call the state wildlife office first. Get their recommendation for facilities." Calvin's mask slipped for just a second, a flash of something harder, more calculating than the helpful wildlife expert he'd been pretending to be. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your attachment, but this animal needs professional care." "I am a professional," Ruby replied, her voice carrying the steel she'd learned in trauma wards. "And I'm saying he stays here until I'm satisfied with his placement." The silence stretched between them like a diagnosis neither wanted to hear. The cub whimpered softly, sensing the tension in the room. Calvin stood slowly, his movements no longer careful but deliberate. When he looked at Ruby, his kind eyes had become calculating, measuring. "I'm afraid that's not an option," he said quietly. "This cub is coming with me today." Ruby's hand moved protectively to the small animal in her lap, and for the first time in 3 years she felt something stronger than loneliness. She felt rage. Ruby had faced down drunk husbands in emergency rooms, aggressive family members demanding impossible miracles, and hospital administrators who cared more about budgets than patients. But she'd never felt the particular chill that came from realizing she was alone in her cabin with a man whose entire identity was a carefully constructed lie. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect from surgical teams, "I think you should leave now." Calvin's professional mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. His shoulders straightened, and the gentle demeanor evaporated like morning mist. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mrs. Thompson. That cub represents a significant investment of time and resources. My clients are expecting delivery." Clients. The word hit Ruby like a physical blow, not a rehabilitation facility, not wildlife conservation. Clients who were expecting delivery of a baby bear like he was a piece of merchandise. "Get out of my house," Ruby said quietly, clutching the cub closer to her chest. The little one seemed to sense the danger, pressing against her with trembling trust. Calvin laughed, a sound devoid of the warmth he'd shown the day before. "You're a 67-year-old woman living alone in the middle of nowhere. No one's going to hear you scream." The threat was clear, and Ruby felt her heart rate spike. But 40 years of medical training had taught her to function under pressure, to think clearly when others panicked. She needed information. She needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. "How much?" she asked. Calvin's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me? How much are your clients paying for him?" Ruby kept her voice steady, clinical. "I'm curious what a baby bear's life is worth to you." "Grizzly cubs are extremely valuable," Calvin said, seeming pleased to finally drop his act. "Especially young, healthy males. Private collectors pay anywhere from $50,000 to $75,000. Exotic pet trade, private zoos, entertainment facilities that need animals that can be trained from infancy." Ruby felt sick. The cub in her arms would spend his life in a cage, performing tricks or living as a novelty for someone wealthy enough to buy a wild animal's freedom. "The mother bear," Ruby said, pieces clicking together. "You set that trap. You were hunting her baby." "Steel traps are perfectly legal in this state with proper permits," Calvin replied. "Though I'll admit the mother proved more resourceful than anticipated. Most bears abandon injured cubs. This one dragged him for miles looking for help." "She brought him to me because she was desperate," Ruby whispered, remembering the mother bear's eyes, the way she'd stepped back and waited, trusting a complete stranger with her child's life. "She brought him to you because you were convenient," Calvin corrected. "And now you're going to hand him over like a reasonable person, or this conversation is going to become very unpleasant." Ruby stood slowly, the cub still cradled against her chest. She'd been threatened before, by addicts seeking drugs, by violent patients, by families who blamed her for losses she couldn't prevent. But those threats had been born of pain or desperation. Calvin's threat came from pure greed, which made him infinitely more dangerous. "No," she said simply. Calvin's face darkened. "Mrs. Thompson, you're making a mistake you can't afford. The only mistake I made was trusting you." Ruby backed toward her kitchen, keeping distance between them. "This baby isn't leaving with you." "Then you're forcing me to take more drastic measures." Calvin reached into his jacket, and Ruby's blood turned to ice when she saw the outline of what was unmistakably a weapon. This wasn't just about animal trafficking. This was about a man who'd kill to protect his business. "Please," Ruby said, hating how her voice shook. "He's just a baby." "He's $50,000, Calvin replied coldly. "And you're nobody, a forgotten old woman whose kids don't even visit. Who's going to miss you?" The words cut deeper than the threat. Who would miss her? Sarah called once a week out of duty. Michael sent Christmas cards. The neighbors were friendly but distant. Calvin was right. She could disappear, and it would be days, maybe weeks, before anyone noticed. But then the cub whimpered in her arms, and Ruby felt something she hadn't experienced since Earl's death. Someone needed her. Not just wanted her help or appreciated her presence, actually needed her to survive. "Earl used to say I was too stubborn for my own good," Ruby said, surprised by the steadiness that had returned to her voice. "I guess we're about to find out if he was right." Calvin stepped forward, his hand moving toward his jacket, and Ruby made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. She ran. The cub bounced against her chest as she burst through her back door and into the forest behind her cabin. Calvin shouted behind her, his heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. Ruby's 67-year-old legs weren't built for running, especially not while carrying a 15-pound bear cub, but terror and determination gave her strength she'd forgotten she possessed. The trees closed around them, offering cover and confusion. Ruby knew these woods better than Calvin did. She'd walked these trails daily for 3 years, memorizing every root and stone during her visits to Earl's grave. She veered left toward the creek, hoping the sound of running water would mask their movement. Behind her, Calvin was shouting threats, his voice growing more distant as Ruby put obstacles between them. "You can't hide forever, old woman. I know where you live." Ruby reached the creek and paused, gasping for breath. The cub was whimpering softly, clearly frightened by the rough treatment but still trusting her completely. His dark eyes held the same faith she'd seen in the mother bear's gaze, absolute belief that Ruby would protect him. "I won't let him hurt you," Ruby whispered, pressing her face against his soft fur. "I promise." But promises were easier to make than keep. Calvin was younger, stronger, and armed. He could simply wait her out, knowing she'd have to return to her cabin eventually. Or he could call others. Ruby was beginning to understand this wasn't a one-man operation. The sound of approaching footsteps sent Ruby moving again, this time toward the old cemetery where Earl lay buried. If she was going to make her last stand, it felt right to do it near the man who'd loved her for 43 years. Earl's headstone came into view just as Ruby heard Calvin crashing through the trees behind her. She collapsed against the granite marker, clutching the cub and fighting for breath. Her heart was hammering dangerously, reminding her that 67-year-old bodies weren't designed for this kind of stress. "Found you," Calvin said, emerging from the tree line with his weapon now visible in his hand. "End of the line, Mrs. Thompson." Ruby looked down at the cub, who was watching her with complete trust despite everything that had happened. In his eyes, she saw every patient she'd ever fought to save, every life she'd held in her hands during 4 decades of nursing. "Earl always said I had healing hands," Ruby said quietly, more to herself than to Calvin. "But sometimes healing means fighting." "Touching," Calvin replied, raising his weapon. "But ultimately pointless." That's when the forest erupted. The mother bear burst from the underbrush like a force of nature, 800 pounds of maternal fury focused entirely on the man threatening her child. Calvin spun around just in time to see his death approaching at 40 miles per hour. His scream echoed through the trees as the massive grizzly slammed into him, sending his weapon flying into the creek. Calvin hit the ground hard, the bear standing over him with her massive paws pinning him down. Her roar shattered the forest silence, not just anger, but the primal sound of a mother defending her young. Calvin lay motionless beneath her, whether from injury or terror, Ruby couldn't tell. The mother bear looked up from her captive to focus on Ruby, who was still clutching the cub against Earl's headstone. For a moment that felt like eternity, the two mothers stared at each other across the cemetery. Ruby saw recognition in the bear's eyes, not just of her scent or appearance, but of what she'd done. This human had risked everything to protect her child. The bear's expression softened, and she made a low, rumbling sound that seemed almost like gratitude. Then, keeping Calvin pinned with one massive paw, she reached her free paw toward Ruby in what could only be described as an invitation. Ruby stood slowly, the cub still in her arms, and walked toward them. The mother bear remained perfectly still as Ruby placed her baby gently on the ground between them. The cub immediately scrambled toward his mother, chittering with relief and joy. The reunion lasted only seconds before the bear turned her attention back to Calvin, who was beginning to stir beneath her weight. She looked at Ruby with what seemed like a question. What should be done with this threat? In the distance, Ruby could hear sirens approaching. Someone must have heard the screaming, the commotion. Help was coming, but it might not arrive in time to save Calvin from a mother bear's justice. Ruby looked down at the man who'd threatened to kill her for protecting an innocent animal, who'd made his living stealing babies from their families. Every instinct told her he deserved whatever the bear decided to do to him. But 40 years of taking an oath to do no harm ran deeper than anger. "Let him live," Ruby said quietly, not sure if the bear could understand, but knowing she had to try. "Let the law handle him now." The bear studied Ruby for a long moment, then stepped back from Calvin with what looked remarkably like reluctance. She gathered her cub against her massive chest, nuzzled him briefly, then looked at Ruby one final time. The gratitude in her eyes was unmistakable. Then mother and child disappeared into the forest, leaving Ruby alone with Calvin's groaning form and the approaching sound of rescue vehicles. As the first sheriff's deputy appeared through the trees, Ruby sank down beside Earl's headstone and allowed herself to cry, not from fear or relief, but from the overwhelming realization that for the first time in 3 years, she'd remembered who she used to be, someone worth saving. The emergency room at Sevier County Medical Center felt like coming home and facing judgment all at once. Ruby sat on the edge of the hospital bed, watching a young doctor examine the scratches on her arms while Sheriff Deputy Martinez took her statement for the 3rd time. Calvin Whitmore lay unconscious in the bed across the hall, his injuries serious but not life-threatening. Multiple lacerations, a dislocated shoulder, and what the doctors suspected was a severe concussion. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Deputy Martinez said, consulting his notepad with obvious skepticism. "You're claiming that Mr. Whitmore threatened you at gunpoint for refusing to hand over a bear cub and that a wild grizzly bear intervened to save you?" Ruby met his gaze steadily. She'd faced skeptical authority figures before, hospital administrators who questioned her judgment, doctors who dismissed her observations, insurance investigators who implied she was lying about workplace injuries. That's exactly what happened. "Mrs. Thompson, with all due respect, that's unusual." "Unusual doesn't mean impossible," Ruby replied. "Check his truck. You'll find equipment for transporting live animals, probably tranquilizers, maybe even cages. Look at his phone records, his bank accounts. This wasn't some random encounter. He's been running an operation." Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, looked up from cleaning Ruby's wounds. "These scratches are consistent with running through heavy brush. The pattern of abrasions suggests rapid movement through thorned undergrowth." She glanced at Deputy Martinez. Someone was definitely running for their life. Ruby felt a surge of gratitude for the young doctor's clinical objectivity. In the chaos of the last few hours, she'd begun to wonder if anyone would believe her story. The rescue team had found Calvin unconscious and severely injured, Ruby sitting calmly beside Earl's grave, and no sign of the bears. Without the physical evidence of Calvin's weapons and veterinary equipment, it would have been easy to dismiss her account as the delusions of a traumatized elderly woman. "We've contacted the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency," Deputy Martinez continued. "They're sending an investigator to examine the scene and search Mr. Whitmore's vehicle. If what you're saying is true—" "It is true," Ruby interrupted, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned in 40 years of medical emergencies. "And I guarantee you'll find evidence of a wildlife trafficking operation that goes far beyond one bear cub." The deputy's radio crackled to life. "Martinez, we need you back at the scene. The TWRA investigator wants to speak with you about what we found in the suspect's truck." Ruby saw the deputy's expression change as he listened to additional details through his earpiece. His skepticism was rapidly being replaced by grim understanding. "Mrs. Thompson," Deputy Martinez said, his tone now respectful rather than doubtful, "it appears your story is checking out. We found tranquilizer equipment, animal restraints, and documentation suggesting Mr. Whitmore has been operating in multiple states. There's also evidence he's been working with a network of collectors and private facilities." The validation should have felt satisfying, but Ruby only felt empty. The Bear family was safe for now, but Calvin's operation clearly extended beyond Tennessee. How many other animals had been stolen from their families? How many mothers were still searching for babies who would never come home? "What happens to him now?" Ruby asked, nodding toward Calvin's room. "Federal charges, most likely. Interstate wildlife trafficking carries serious penalties. He's looking at significant prison time." Deputy Martinez closed his notepad. "You probably saved more lives than just that bear cub today." After the deputy left, Ruby sat alone in the quiet hospital room, staring at the familiar sights and sounds that had defined her working life for 4 decades. The antiseptic smell, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the soft voices of nurses coordinating care in the hallway. She'd thought this world was behind her, that she'd been put out to pasture like an old horse too tired to pull the wagon. But today she'd felt like herself again. Not the forgotten widow who talked to her husband's gravestone, but the fierce protector who'd spent her career standing between patients and harm. Dr. Chen returned with discharge papers and a prescription for pain medication. Ruby knew she wouldn't need. "Physically, you're remarkably well for someone who experienced what you did today," the doctor said. "But trauma can manifest in delayed ways. Don't hesitate to seek counseling if you experience nightmares, anxiety, or—" "Doctor," Ruby interrupted gently. "I've seen more trauma in 40 years of emergency medicine than most people see in a lifetime. Today wasn't traumatic. Today was the first time in 3 years I felt alive." The young physician studied Ruby with newfound interest. "You were a nurse?" "Vanderbilt Medical Center, then Wilderness Emergency Response. Retired 3 years ago when my husband passed." Ruby stood slowly, testing her balance. "I thought retirement meant becoming invisible. Today reminded me that experience doesn't expire just because you get old." Dr. Chen smiled. "There's a volunteer program here at the hospital. Former medical professionals who mentor new staff, provide patient support." "If you're interested." "I might be," Ruby said, surprised by how quickly the possibility sparked interest. "Let me think about it." The drive back to her cabin took Ruby through the center of town, past the small shops and restaurants that had barely registered during her 3 years of self-imposed isolation. She'd been so focused on grief, on the emptiness Earl's death had left behind, that she'd forgotten there was still a community here. People who might value her experience, who might benefit from what she'd learned about healing and fighting and refusing to give up. Ruby's cabin looked different as she pulled into the gravel driveway. Not physically, the same weathered logs, the same front porch where she'd sat countless evenings talking to Earl's memory. But the building no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like home base, the place she returned to between missions, rather than the place she waited to die. The guest room still showed signs of the morning's drama: overturned medical supplies, the heating pad still plugged in where the bear cub had rested. Ruby cleaned methodically, but instead of erasing the evidence of what had happened, she found herself preserving it. The torn towels that had comforted a frightened animal, the bowl that had held water for someone who desperately needed care. These weren't just remnants of a crisis, they were proof that she'd made a difference. Ruby's phone rang just as she finished putting the room back together. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Ruby felt the familiar mixture of love and disappointment that came with her daughter's dutiful weekly check-ins. "Hi, sweetheart," Ruby answered, settling into Earl's old recliner. "Mom, are you okay?" "I got the strangest call from someone at the sheriff's department saying you'd been involved in some kind of incident with a bear." Ruby could hear the worry in Sarah's voice, but also the underlying assumption that her elderly mother had somehow misunderstood or exaggerated whatever had actually happened. It was the same tone medical professionals used when elderly patients reported symptoms that seemed unlikely or inconsistent. "I'm fine, honey. There was a situation, but it's resolved now." "Mom, what situation?" "The deputy said something about wildlife trafficking and weapons. That can't be right." Ruby found herself smiling as she began to tell the story, not the sanitized version she might have shared to avoid worry, but the full truth. Sarah's responses progressed from confusion to disbelief to amazement as Ruby described Calvin's deception, the chase through the forest, and the mother bear's intervention. "You fought off an armed criminal?" Sarah's voice had risen an octave. "Mom, you could have been killed." "But I wasn't," Ruby replied calmly. "And that baby bear is safe with his mother because someone was willing to fight for him." There was a long pause before Sarah spoke again, and when she did, her voice carried a note Ruby hadn't heard in years. Not just love, but respect. "Mom, I had no idea you were dealing with something like this. I've been so busy with work. I haven't really thought about what your life is like up there." "I know, sweetheart. You have your own life to live. But that's just it. I've been treating you like you're just waiting around to die. Like retirement means you stopped being the person you always were. The person who never backed down from a fight when someone needed protecting." Ruby felt tears threatening, but they weren't the bitter tears of loneliness she'd shed so often over the past 3 years. These were tears of recognition, of being seen again as the woman she'd always been. "I love you, baby girl," Ruby said softly. "I love you too, Mom. And I'm proud of you, so proud." After they hung up, Ruby sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the mountain evening. But tonight, instead of feeling isolated by the wilderness around her, she felt connected to it. She was part of something larger, a community that included humans and animals, young and old, the living and the remembered. Somewhere in those dark trees, a mother bear was sleeping peacefully with her cub, knowing that not all humans were threats. And in this small cabin, a widow was discovering that her story wasn't over yet. It was just beginning a new chapter. The heart attack came 3 days later, just as Ruby was beginning to believe the worst was behind her. She'd been standing at her kitchen sink, washing the coffee mug she'd used during yet another sleepless night, when the crushing pain exploded across her chest like a steel trap closing around her heart. The mug shattered against the porcelain as Ruby collapsed, her left arm going numb, her vision narrowing to a tunnel of gray static. "Not now," she gasped to the empty kitchen, crawling toward the phone on unsteady hands. "Please, God, not now." But even as Ruby dialed 911 with trembling fingers, she knew this wasn't just about timing. The stress of the past week, the confrontation with Calvin, the chase through the forest, the adrenaline crash that followed had pushed her 67-year-old heart beyond its limits. Dr. Chen had warned her about delayed physical reactions to trauma, but Ruby had dismissed the concern with the confidence of someone who'd spent 4 decades treating other people's medical crises. She'd forgotten that healers could break too. The paramedics found her conscious but barely coherent on her kitchen floor, her skin gray and clammy, her pulse erratic and weak. Ruby recognized the symptoms with detached medical clarity even as her body betrayed her. Massive myocardial infarction, possibly involving multiple vessels, prognosis uncertain without immediate intervention. "Ma'am, can you tell us your name?" The young EMT's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Ruby May Thompson," she managed between gasps. "Widow, no, next of kin, locally." "We're going to take good care of you, Mrs. Thompson. Just try to stay calm." Stay calm. Ruby almost laughed, but laughing required oxygen she didn't have. She was dying alone in the cabin where she'd spent 3 years learning to be invisible, and the bitter irony wasn't lost on her. After finally remembering who she was, after rediscovering her purpose in protecting that bear cub, her body was shutting down like a machine that had run too hard for too long. As the paramedics worked to stabilize her for transport, Ruby's mind drifted to Calvin Whitmore, lying unconscious in a hospital bed 30 miles away. At least when he woke up, he'd wake up to face justice for his crimes. She would wake up to face the brutal mathematics of cardiac damage and recovery odds for elderly patients, if she woke up at all. The ambulance ride passed in fragments, the rhythmic jolting of the vehicle, the urgent voices of medical professionals speaking in the coded language she'd once used to discuss other people's emergencies, the high-pitched whine of machines keeping her alive. Ruby tried to focus on their words, to participate in her own care the way she'd trained thousands of patients to do, but consciousness kept slipping away like water through broken fingers. At Sevier County Medical Center, the emergency team worked with practiced efficiency that Ruby recognized from her own decades in trauma medicine. Cardiac catheterization revealed what the EKG had suggested: a massive heart attack involving the left anterior descending artery, the vessel doctors grimly called the Widowmaker. The irony of the name wasn't lost on Ruby as she signed consent forms for emergency surgery with a hand that could barely hold a pen. She was already a widow. Now she was facing the vessel that had made countless other women widows, the great equalizer that didn't care about good intentions or heroic acts or bear cubs saved from wildlife traffickers. Dr. Patricia Williams, the cardiac surgeon, spoke with the gentle authority Ruby remembered from her own difficult conversations with families. Mrs. Thompson, we need to perform an emergency angioplasty to restore blood flow to your heart. The procedure carries risks, especially given the extent of the damage, but without intervention. I understand, Ruby whispered, sparing the doctor from having to state the obvious. Without surgery, she would die. With surgery, she might live, but with significant limitations, reduced heart function, restricted activity, the kind of diminished existence that made people question whether survival was worth the cost. Is there someone we should call? Dr. Williams asked gently. Family? Ruby closed her eyes, thinking of Sarah in California, Michael in Florida. By the time they could arrange flights and travel, any calls would likely be to discuss funeral arrangements rather than bedside vigils. My daughter, Sarah, Ruby managed, reciting the phone number she'd memorized 40 years ago when Sarah was born. Tell her I'm not giving up. But as they wheeled Ruby toward the cardiac catheterization lab, she wondered if that promise was one she could keep. Her body felt like it was shutting down piece by piece. First her strength during the chase through the forest, then her emotional reserves during the confrontation with Calvin, and now her heart itself. Maybe this was simply the natural end of her story, the final chapter of a life that had accomplished what it was meant to accomplish. She'd saved the bear cub. She'd stopped Calvin's trafficking operation. She'd remembered, for one shining moment, who Ruby Mae Thompson really was beneath the grief and loneliness and self-doubt. Maybe that was enough. The anesthesia pulled Ruby down into darkness just as she heard Dr. Williams explaining the procedure to the surgical team. The last thing she remembered was the familiar sound of medical professionals coordinating care, the language she'd spoken fluently for 40 years but would now experience from the other side. Ruby's dreams during surgery were vivid and strange. Not the typical anesthesia confusion, but something deeper and more purposeful. She found herself walking through the forest behind her cabin, but it wasn't the Tennessee woods she knew. This forest was filled with every patient she'd ever treated, every life she'd touched during her 4 decades of nursing. They were all there. The car accident victim she'd stabilized during her first year at Vanderbilt. The elderly farmer whose heart attack she'd recognized during a wilderness medical call. The countless children she'd comforted during their parents' worst moments. They walked beside her without speaking, their presence a reminder of all the times her hands had made a difference, all the moments when her knowledge and compassion had stood between someone and death. At the center of the forest clearing stood Earl, looking exactly as he had on their wedding day, young and strong and full of faith in their future together. But beside him was the bear cub, healthy and playful, tumbling through the leaves while his mother watched from the tree line. Am I dying? Ruby asked Earl, surprised that her voice worked normally in this strange place. We're all dying, Ruby Mae, Earl replied with the gentle smile she'd fallen in love with 50 years ago. The question is whether we're also living. I tried to live, Ruby said, feeling tears on her cheeks. After you died, I tried to keep going, but I forgot how. No, Earl said firmly. You forgot for a while, but you remembered when it mattered. That little one there, he's alive because you chose to fight for him. His mama's alive because you chose to fight for her. That's not forgetting how to live. That's remembering why living matters. The bear cub looked up at Ruby with the same trusting eyes she remembered, then padded over to nuzzle against her hand. His fur was warm and soft, and she could feel his heartbeat under her palm, strong and steady and full of the future. But I'm so tired, Ruby whispered. Being tired doesn't mean being finished, Earl said. Sometimes being tired just means you've been working harder than you knew. Ruby woke up 12 hours later in the cardiac intensive care unit, surrounded by the steady beeping of monitors and the soft voices of nurses checking her vital signs. Dr. Williams stood beside her bed, reviewing a chart with the expression of someone delivering cautiously optimistic news. The surgery was successful, Dr. Williams said when she saw Ruby's eyes focus. We were able to restore blood flow and place 2 stents. Your heart sustained significant damage, but you're stable. Stable. In medical terms, it meant the immediate crisis had passed, but the long-term prognosis remained uncertain. Ruby understood the careful neutrality in the doctor's voice, professional optimism tempered by realistic expectations. "How long?" Ruby asked, her voice barely audible through the oxygen mask. "Recovery will take months," Dr. Williams replied. "Your activity will be limited for quite some time. But Mrs. Thompson, you're alive. Given the severity of the attack, that's not something we take for granted." Ruby closed her eyes, processing the reality of her new limitations. No more hiking through the forest to visit Earl's grave. No more independence in her remote cabin. No more pretending she was still the strong, capable woman who could face down armed criminals and outrun danger through the woods. But as despair began to settle over her like a familiar blanket, Ruby heard something that changed everything. A commotion in the hallway, urgent voices, and the sound of someone demanding to see her immediately. Sarah had come home. Sarah burst through the ICU doors like a force of nature, her business suit wrinkled from the red-eye flight, her usually perfect hair disheveled from running through airport terminals. Behind her came Michael, looking equally frantic. And behind him, to Ruby's complete shock, came her grandchildren. Tommy, now 16 and taller than his father, and little Emma, barely 8 years old with Ruby's own stubborn chin. "Mom," Sarah breathed, rushing to Ruby's bedside with tears streaming down her face. "Oh God, Mom, we thought we'd lost you." Ruby tried to speak, but found her throat thick with emotion. After 3 years of dutiful weekly phone calls and obligatory holiday greetings, her children had dropped everything to be here. Not just the children, the grandchildren she'd barely seen since Earl's funeral, who probably hardly remembered her beyond the Christmas cards with $20 bills tucked inside. "We saw the news," Michael said, his voice shaking as he took Ruby's hand. "About what you did with the bear, about stopping that criminal. Mom, why didn't you tell us what was happening?" "The local news picked up the story," Sarah explained, pulling a chair close to Ruby's bed. "Then it went viral on social media. Someone filmed the aftermath, you sitting by Dad's grave while they arrested that man. Do you have any idea how many people are calling you a hero?" Ruby blinked in confusion. Hero? She'd been focused on surviving surgery, on the grim mathematics of cardiac recovery. The idea that her confrontation with Calvin had become public knowledge, much less viral news, seemed impossible. Tommy stepped forward, holding his phone with the awkward confidence of a teenager navigating adult emotions. "Grandma Ruby, you're everywhere. Look." The phone screen showed a shaky video taken from a distance, Ruby sitting calmly beside Earl's headstone while paramedics treated Calvin's injuries. The caption read, "67-year-old retired nurse fights off armed wildlife trafficker to save bear cub. When police arrived, they found her waiting by her husband's grave like a guardian angel." 3 million views, Emma announced proudly, though Ruby suspected the 8-year-old didn't fully understand what any of this meant. "Mrs. Henderson at school said you're famous now." Ruby felt overwhelmed by the strange unreality of it all. While she'd been fighting for her life in surgery, her story had apparently taken on a life of its own. But more important than viral fame was the realization slowly dawning on her. Her children weren't here out of obligation or guilt. They were here because they'd been genuinely afraid of losing her. "I should have called," Ruby whispered, her voice still weak from the breathing tube. "When Calvin threatened me, I should have—" "You couldn't have known," Sarah interrupted. "Mom, You handled an impossible situation perfectly. But what we can't understand is why you've been dealing with everything alone. The loneliness, the isolation, feeling like you don't matter anymore. Ruby looked at her daughter's face, really looked, and saw something she'd missed during 3 years of carefully cheerful phone conversations. Sarah wasn't just successful and busy, she was guilty. Guilty about the distance, about the infrequent visits, about leaving her mother to grieve alone in a mountain cabin. "I thought you had moved on," Ruby said quietly. "Your own lives, your own families. I didn't want to be a burden." "A burden?" Michael's voice cracked. "Mom, you're not a burden. You're our mother. You're the woman who worked double shifts to pay for our college, who drove 6 hours each way to every school play and graduation, who taught us that protecting people was worth any sacrifice." "We just forgot to protect you," Sarah added, wiping tears from her cheeks. "We let you disappear into that cabin like you were already gone." Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the number of visitors crowding the ICU room, but unable to bring herself to separate a family that had obviously been fractured for too long. "Mrs. Thompson needs rest," the doctor said gently. "But I have to say the improvement in her vital signs since you all arrived is remarkable. Sometimes the best medicine isn't something we can prescribe." Over the next 2 days, as Ruby's condition stabilized and she was moved from ICU to a regular cardiac unit, the full scope of what had happened began to unfold. The viral video had triggered an avalanche of media attention, but more importantly, it had sparked a federal investigation into wildlife trafficking that reached far beyond Calvin Whitmore. Deputy Martinez visited with updates that painted Calvin's operation as part of a multi-state network involving dozens of exotic animal dealers, private collectors, and corrupt officials. Ruby's confrontation had provided the brake law enforcement needed to unravel the entire organization. "Your actions saved more than one bear cub," Deputy Martinez explained. "We've rescued 43 animals from various facilities, and we're still counting. Some of these creatures have been in captivity for years." But the most unexpected development came from an unlikely source: Calvin himself. Ruby was eating lunch with Emma, who was patiently helping her grandmother navigate the hospital's iPad to read supportive messages from strangers around the world, when Dr. Williams appeared with a visitor request that left everyone speechless. "Calvin Whitmore is asking to see you," Dr. Williams said carefully. "He's been released from medical custody into federal custody, but he specifically requested a few minutes to speak with you before his transfer." "You have every right to refuse." Sarah immediately stood up, her protective instincts flaring. "Absolutely not. That man threatened to kill our mother." "It's okay," Ruby said quietly, surprising everyone, including herself. "I'll see him." The conversation took place in Ruby's hospital room with 2 federal marshals present and Sarah hovering protectively nearby. Calvin looked smaller than Ruby remembered, not physically diminished by his injuries, but somehow deflated, stripped of the predatory confidence that had made him so frightening in her cabin. "Mrs. Thompson," Calvin began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable." Ruby studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or false remorse. Instead, she saw something she recognized from 40 years of nursing: genuine human brokenness. "My son," Calvin continued, his voice breaking, "Tyler, he's 8 years old, and he has acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The treatments, the experimental trials, insurance doesn't cover everything. I started with just one cub, telling myself it was temporary, just until Tyler got better." Ruby's heart ached despite everything Calvin had put her through. She understood desperate parents, understood the lengths people would go to save their children. "But it never stopped," Calvin went on. "Each temporary transaction led to bigger opportunities, more money, more animals. I told myself Tyler needed me to be successful, but the truth is, I became addicted to the money. And when you threatened to expose everything, you were willing to kill me." Ruby finished quietly. Calvin nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I became a monster. And the worst part is, when Tyler found out what I was doing, his treatment team showed him the news coverage, he was ashamed of me. My own son, fighting for his life, was ashamed that his father had become the kind of person who hurt innocent animals." Ruby was quiet for a long moment, processing Calvin's words against her own understanding of desperation and moral compromise. Finally, she spoke. "What happens to Tyler now?" "My ex-wife has custody. She's better off without me. Tyler deserves better than a father who thought money was more important than integrity." One of the federal marshals cleared his throat, indicating their time was almost up. Calvin looked directly at Ruby with the expression of someone who had lost everything, but finally understood what really mattered. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know the way you fought for that cub, the way you risked everything to protect something innocent and helpless, that's the kind of person I should have been for my son. Not someone who justified evil for financial gain, but someone who modeled real courage." After Calvin was led away, Ruby sat in the strange silence that followed such encounters. Sarah was furious about the visit, feeling it was manipulative and inappropriate. But Ruby found herself thinking about Tyler Whitmore, an 8-year-old boy fighting cancer while watching his father's crimes play out on national news. "I want to do something," Ruby announced suddenly. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked warily. Ruby reached for her phone, her movements still slow but determined. "That GoFundMe platform Emma showed me. I want to start one. For Tyler's medical expenses." The room erupted in protests. Sarah was incredulous. Michael was concerned about Ruby's judgment, and even the federal marshals exchanged glances that suggested this was highly unusual. "Mom," Sarah said carefully, "that man threatened to kill you. His son's illness doesn't excuse what he did." "No, it doesn't," Ruby agreed. "But punishing a sick child for his father's crimes doesn't make us righteous. It just makes us cruel." Ruby's decision to help Calvin's son became the second viral moment of her unexpected internet fame. The GoFundMe page she created, titled Tyler's Fight, Healing Beyond Justice, raised over $300,000 in less than a week. But more than the money, the campaign sparked conversations about justice versus vengeance, about the responsibility society bears for the families of criminals, and about the courage required to show mercy to those who had shown none. Tyler's mother, Jessica Whitmore, called Ruby personally to express her gratitude. Through tears, she explained that Tyler had been following Ruby's story and had asked specifically to meet the bear lady who forgave Daddy. "He says you're the first grown-up who acted like a real hero," Jessica explained. "Not someone who just fought the bad guy, but someone who cared about what happened to everyone afterward." Ruby agreed to a video call with Tyler and found herself face to face with a pale, thin boy whose eyes held wisdom far beyond his 8 years. He was bald from chemotherapy, but smiled with genuine warmth when he saw Ruby. "Mrs. Ruby," Tyler said, his voice weak but determined, "my daddy did really bad things, and I'm sorry he hurt you." "Thank you, sweet boy," Ruby replied, her heart breaking for this child who felt responsible for his father's choices. "But you didn't do anything wrong. Your daddy made his own choices, and they weren't your fault." "I know, but I'm glad you're okay." "And I'm glad the bear baby is okay, too." Tyler paused, then added with the matter-of-fact wisdom of children facing mortality, "My mommy says you have a hurt heart now, like me. Are you going to be okay?" Ruby looked at this brave little boy, fighting for his life while worrying about others, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not physical healing, that would take months, but emotional restoration. "You know what, Tyler? I think we're both going to be just fine." As Ruby hung up the phone, she realized the truth of her own words. For the first time since Earl's death, she wasn't just surviving day by day. She was planning for a future that included purpose, connection, and the kind of love that extended beyond family lines and species boundaries. The bear cub had saved her long before she saved him, and now, perhaps, she could help save others. 6 months later, Ruby Mae Thompson stood on her front porch watching the early morning mist rise from the valley below, her heart monitor beeping steadily in the rhythm that had become as familiar as her own breathing. The cardiac rehabilitation had been brutal. Months of carefully measured exercise, dietary restrictions, and the humbling acceptance that her 73-year-old body would never again be the fearless instrument it had been during her nursing days. But she was alive. More than alive, she was purposeful in ways she'd never imagined possible. The cabin looked different now, transformed from a widow's retreat into something resembling a small wildlife sanctuary. Sarah and Michael had spent their summer vacation building wheelchair-accessible ramps, installing security cameras, and creating what Emma proudly called Grandma's Animal Hospital. The guest room where the bear cub had recovered now housed a rotating collection of injured wildlife, orphaned raccoons, injured hawks, and the occasional fox kit brought by Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency volunteers who'd learned to trust Ruby's expertise. "Another busy day ahead?" Dr. Sarah Chen asked, climbing the front steps with her medical bag and the easy smile that had become Ruby's favorite part of their weekly house calls. "Always," Ruby replied, gesturing toward the makeshift nursery where soft, chittering sounds indicated their current residents were awake and hungry. 3 baby raccoons whose mother was hit by a car and a hawk with a wing fracture that's healing nicely, Dr. Chen had become more than Ruby's cardiologist. She'd become the bridge between Ruby's medical knowledge and the official wildlife rehabilitation network. When the state had initially balked at allowing an elderly cardiac patient to care for wild animals, Dr. Chen had advocated fiercely for Ruby's mental and emotional well-being. "Mrs. Thompson's recovery has been remarkable," Dr. Chen had told the wildlife officials. "Her sense of purpose is literally keeping her heart strong. Taking that away would be medical malpractice." The arrangement that emerged was unprecedented. Ruby became Tennessee's first officially recognized senior wildlife rehabilitator, working under state supervision with regular medical oversight. Her decades of medical experience combined with her newfound internet fame made her the perfect spokesperson for wildlife conservation efforts across the Southeast. "How's your energy level today, Doctor?" Chen asked, checking Ruby's blood pressure with practiced efficiency. "Better than yesterday, not as good as I'd like," Ruby answered honestly. The heart attack had left permanent damage and she tired more easily than she cared to admit. But the fatigue was different now, the exhaustion of meaningful work rather than the bone-deep weariness of purposeless days. "Your numbers look excellent," Dr. Chen announced. "Heart rate stable, blood pressure well controlled. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." What Ruby was doing defied easy categorization. Part wildlife rehabilitator, part internet sensation, part unexpected symbol of senior empowerment, she'd become a living reminder that retirement didn't mean retirement from relevance. The video calls with Tyler Whitmore had become a weekly tradition. His leukemia treatment was progressing well, funded by the GoFundMe campaign that had grown far beyond Ruby's initial modest goal. More importantly, Tyler had become Ruby's unofficial junior wildlife expert, learning about animal care through their video sessions and sharing his knowledge with other children at the Pediatric Oncology Center. "Mrs. Ruby?" Tyler's voice called from Ruby's tablet as Dr. Chen finished her examination. "Can you show me the new raccoon babies?" Ruby carried the tablet to the nursery, where 3 tiny raccoons were nursing from bottles held by Emma, who'd convinced her parents to let her spend the entire summer with her grandmother. The sight of her 8-year-old granddaughter patiently feeding orphaned wildlife while chatting with a young cancer patient across the country never failed to move Ruby to tears. "They're so little," Tyler exclaimed from the screen. "Do they know their mama's gone?" "They know something's different," Ruby explained patiently. "But they're safe now, and they'll be returned to the wild when they're old enough to survive on their own." "Like the bear baby?" Ruby smiled. The bear cub, whom the internet had nicknamed Hope, had indeed been returned to the wild after a careful rehabilitation process overseen by state wildlife experts. But the reunion with his mother had been captured on camera by a Tennessee wildlife photographer, creating another viral moment that cemented Ruby's status as the bear whisperer of the Smokies. "Exactly like Hope," Ruby confirmed. "Speaking of which, I have news about your favorite bear family." Tyler's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? What?" Ruby turned the tablet toward a photo album Sarah had compiled. Images from motion-activated trail cameras placed throughout the forest behind Ruby's cabin. The pictures showed Hope, now nearly full-grown, returning regularly to the area with his mother. But more remarkably, they showed him bringing his own family, a mate and 2 cubs of his own. "He remembers this place," Ruby explained to Tyler's delighted squeals. "Animals have much longer memories than most people realize. This forest feels safe to him because it's where he learned that humans could be healers instead of hunters." The truth was more complex than Ruby shared with Tyler. Wildlife biologists had confirmed that Hope's regular returns were highly unusual behavior for rehabilitated bears. Most animals, once returned to the wild, avoided human contact entirely. But Hope seemed drawn to Ruby's property, though he maintained a respectful distance. Dr. Martinez, the wildlife biologist who'd taken over monitoring the bear family, had her own theory. "I think that Bear associates Mrs. Thompson's scent with safety," she'd explained during her last visit. "In some ways, she's become part of his understanding of this territory, not as a human to be feared, but as a presence that means protection." After Tyler signed off to attend his physical therapy session, Ruby and Emma spent the morning caring for their animal residents. The routine had become second nature, checking temperatures, administering medications, cleaning enclosures, and documenting progress with the thoroughness Ruby had learned in decades of medical charting. "Grandma Ruby," Emma said as they prepared formula for the raccoon kits, "do you think Hope remembers being scared?" It was the kind of profound question children asked without realizing their profundity. Ruby considered her answer carefully. "I think he remembers being hurt and being helped," Ruby replied. "Animals don't hold grudges the way humans do, but they remember kindness. That's why he keeps coming back, not because he's still scared, but because he learned this place is special." "Like how you're special." Ruby knelt beside her granddaughter, ignoring the protest from her reconstructed heart. "Sweetheart, I'm not special. I just decided to care about something besides my own sadness." "But that is special," Emma insisted with 8-year-old logic. "Most grown-ups just complain about stuff. You actually fix things." That afternoon brought Ruby's favorite part of the week, the arrival of the Wildlife Wednesday volunteers. What had started as a small group of local retirees interested in animal care had grown into a network of dozens of seniors who'd found new purpose in wildlife rehabilitation. Betty Carmichael, a 71-year-old former teacher, arrived first with her carefully organized supply kit and endless patience for animal feeding schedules. Behind her came Robert Chen, Dr. Chen's father, a retired engineer who'd designed ingenious wildlife enclosures, and Martha Stewart, not the famous one, but a 68-year-old former accountant who managed the financial aspects of their growing operation. "How's our celebrity patient today?" Betty asked, checking on the hawk whose wing fracture had made him temporarily flightless. Cantankerous as ever, Ruby replied fondly, but his x-rays show excellent healing. Dr. Martinez thinks we can start flight conditioning next week. The volunteers worked with quiet efficiency, each having found their specialized role in the rehabilitation process. What struck Ruby most about these weekly gatherings wasn't their effectiveness with the animals, though they were remarkably skilled, but the transformation she saw in the volunteers themselves. Betty had been profoundly depressed after her husband's death from Alzheimer's. Robert had struggled with retirement after a 60-year engineering career. Martha had felt invisible after her children moved away, and her accounting firm replaced her with younger employees. Now they moved with purpose, sharing stories and laughter while caring for creatures that depended entirely on their compassion. They'd found what Ruby had discovered, that healing others could heal yourself, that being needed was better medicine than any prescription. "Mrs. Thompson," a young voice called from the front porch. Ruby looked up to see a girl of perhaps 15, accompanied by an older woman who looked familiar. "I'm Jessica Whitmore," the woman said, her voice nervous but determined. "This is my daughter, Ashley. We were hoping. Tyler really wants to meet you in person." Ruby's heart clenched as she realized Tyler had made the journey from Alabama with his mother and sister. The boy looked fragile but alert, his bald head covered by a baseball cap decorated with bear silhouettes. "Tyler!" Ruby exclaimed, opening her arms as the boy approached shyly. "You're even braver in person than you are on video calls." The hug they shared was gentle, both of them careful of each other's physical limitations, but filled with the warmth of a friendship that had sustained them both through difficult recoveries. "Can I see the raccoon babies?" Tyler asked, his voice stronger than Ruby had expected. "Of course. But first, I have someone I want you to meet." Ruby led Tyler and his family to the back porch, where Emma was cleaning the hawk's enclosure with Betty's supervision. The introduction between the two children was magical. Tyler's medical wisdom combining with Emma's wildlife knowledge as they discussed animal care with the seriousness of seasoned professionals. As Ruby watched Tyler carefully bottle feed a raccoon kit, while Emma explained proper feeding techniques, she felt the familiar fullness in her chest that had nothing to do with her cardiac condition. This was what healing looked like. Not just the mending of broken hearts or injured wings, but the creation of connections that transcended pain and loss. When Tyler's family finally left at sunset, promising to return for another visit, Ruby stood on her porch watching their car disappear down the mountain road. The forest around her was settling into evening quiet, and somewhere in those trees she knew Hope and his family were bedding down for the night in the safety they'd learned to associate with this place. Ruby's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Saw the photos Emma posted. Tyler looked so happy. You're creating miracles, Mom." Miracles. Ruby smiled at her daughter's choice of words. What they were creating here wasn't miraculous. It was simply the result of choosing love over fear, purpose over comfort, connection over isolation. At 73, with a damaged heart and limited mobility, Ruby Mae Thompson had finally learned the secret Earl had tried to teach her 43 years ago. Life wasn't about the length of your days, but the depth of your compassion and the width of your impact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals to heal, new people to connect with. But tonight, Ruby was content to sit in Earl's old rocking chair, listening to the sounds of the forest that had become her extended family, knowing that sometimes the most important journeys begin not when you're young and strong, but when you're broken and brave enough to start over. The bear cub had saved her life by teaching her that healing and being healed were the same sacred act. And Ruby Mae Thompson was just getting started. Sometimes we think our best years are behind us, that retirement means becoming invisible, that our children don't need us anymore, that the wisdom we've gained through decades of living somehow expires when we hit a certain age. Ruby Mae Thompson felt exactly that way at 67, sitting alone in her mountain cabin, convinced she was just taking up space in a world that had moved on without her. But when a desperate mother bear brought her dying cub to Ruby's doorstep, everything changed. Ruby discovered that her nursing skills, her compassion, her fierce protective instincts, none of it had diminished with age. In fact, her experience made her more valuable, not less. She became a hero not despite her age, but because of everything those years had taught her about healing, fighting for what's right, and never giving up on those who need protection. Ruby's story reminds us that purpose doesn't retire at 65, that love doesn't have an expiration date, and that sometimes our most important chapters are written when others think our story is ending. Your wisdom matters. Your heart matters. You matter, more now than ever. What moment in your life made you feel most needed? Have you ever surprised yourself with your own strength when someone or something depended on you? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you've made a difference, no matter your age. 3 years after that life-changing morning when Ruby first encountered the injured bear cub, the autumn leaves were painting the Great Smoky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson that took her breath away. Ruby stood on the expanded deck of her cabin, now officially designated as the Thompson Wildlife Recovery Center, watching her latest group of volunteers prepare for the day's activities. At 76, Ruby moved more slowly than she once had, her rebuilt heart requiring careful attention to pacing and medication schedules. But her mind remained sharp as a scalpel, and her dedication to wildlife rehabilitation had only deepened with time. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one bear cub had evolved into a nationally recognized program that had rehabilitated over 300 animals and trained more than 50 senior volunteers in wildlife care. "Mrs. Ruby, the film crew is here," Emma called from the driveway. Now 11 years old and spending every summer with her grandmother, Emma had become Ruby's unofficial assistant director, managing volunteers and coordinating with the various documentary teams that regularly visited to capture the ongoing story of the Bear Whisperer of Tennessee. Ruby smiled, adjusting her volunteer badge that read Chief Healing Officer in Emma's careful handwriting. Today marked the premiere of the Netflix documentary that had been filming at the center for over a year. Wild Hearts, a story of second chances, would introduce Ruby's story to millions of viewers worldwide. But more importantly, it would showcase the transformative power of intergenerational purpose. The camera crew had been following not just Ruby's work with animals, but the remarkable stories of her volunteer network. There was Margaret Chen, 82, who'd found new meaning after losing her husband to dementia by specializing in orphaned baby birds. James Roosevelt, 71, a former coal miner who'd discovered a gift for building innovative wildlife enclosures. And Sarah Beth Williams, 68, whose depression after early retirement had lifted completely when she began coordinating the center's educational programs with local schools. "Ready for your close-up, Grandma?" Sarah asked, arriving with Michael and his new wife, Patricia, who'd embraced Ruby with the warmth of a daughter from their first meeting. The whole family had made the trip from their respective homes to celebrate the documentary premiere together. "I'm always ready," Ruby replied with a grin that belied her age. "But I think our real stars are getting impatient." She gestured toward the large enclosure where their current residents were housed. 2 adolescent black bears who'd been orphaned in a wildfire, a red-tailed hawk recovering from a collision injury, and a family of raccoons preparing for release back into the wild. Each animal represented not just a successful rehabilitation, but a story of humans choosing compassion over indifference. The documentary crew had captured the most extraordinary moment just 2 weeks earlier. Hope, the original bear cub Ruby had saved, had returned to the area with his own mate and twin cubs. The motion-activated cameras caught something unprecedented. Hope teaching his cubs to forage in the same clearing where Ruby had first found him bleeding and broken. Dr. Martinez, now the state's leading expert on human-wildlife interaction, had called it generational knowledge transfer in real time. Hope was passing on not just survival skills, but the understanding that this particular patch of forest represented safety, that the human scent here meant protection rather than threat. "It's remarkable," Dr. Martinez explained to the documentary cameras. "We're witnessing the establishment of a new behavioral pattern that could influence bear populations for generations. Mrs. Thompson didn't just save one cub. She may have changed how an entire family line relates to humans. But the real transformation had occurred in the human community. Ruby's Center had become a pilgrimage site for seniors across the country seeking renewed purpose. The waiting list for volunteer positions stretched 6 months, with applications arriving from retired teachers, nurses, engineers, and business professionals who'd heard about the program through word of mouth and social media. Tyler Whitmore, now 14 and in full remission from his leukemia, had become one of Ruby's most effective ambassadors. His video calls with cancer patients worldwide had evolved into a formal program connecting young patients with wildlife rehabilitation centers, giving children something hopeful to focus on during treatment. His father, Calvin, serving a federal sentence for wildlife trafficking, had written Ruby a letter expressing gratitude for the forgiveness that had allowed his son to heal from shame as well as illness. "The transformation in Tyler has been remarkable," Jessica Whitmore had told the documentary crew during their interview. When his father was arrested, Tyler blamed himself. He thought being sick had somehow caused his dad to become a criminal. But Mrs. Thompson showed him that healing, whether from cancer or heartbreak, happens when we focus on helping others instead of dwelling on our own pain. As the documentary cameras rolled, Ruby found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The terrified, lonely widow who'd first encountered that injured bear cub barely resembled the woman she'd become. That woman had been shrinking into invisibility, convinced her useful years were behind her. This woman was expanding into influence, understanding that wisdom and experience were just beginning to bear fruit. What would you say to other seniors who feel like their best years are behind them? The documentary director asked during Ruby's final interview. Ruby considered the question carefully, as she always did when speaking to audiences who might be facing their own crossroads of purpose and meaning. "I'd say that feeling forgotten is not the same as being useless," Ruby replied, her voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience. "I spent 3 years after Earl's death convinced that without my nursing career and my role as a wife, I was just taking up space in the world. But saving that bear cub taught me something profound. Our capacity to heal, to protect, to make a difference doesn't diminish with age, it deepens." She paused, looking out at the enclosures where rescued animals were preparing for their return to freedom. "Every person watching this has spent decades accumulating knowledge, developing empathy, understanding the world in ways that only come with time. That's not something to retire from. That's something to deploy." Whether it's wildlife rehabilitation, mentoring young people, volunteering in hospitals, or simply being present for neighbors who need support, there's always someone or something that needs exactly what you have to offer. The documentary captured Ruby's daily routine in loving detail. The 5 a.m. medication schedule and vital sign checks, the careful preparation of specialized diets for various species, the patient teaching of new volunteers, and the weekly video calls with Tyler and other young people following their journeys. But perhaps the most powerful footage showed the quiet moments. Ruby sitting with a frightened animal, her presence alone providing comfort. The laughter shared with volunteers who'd found unexpected friendship in their mutual commitment to healing. The tears of joy when successfully rehabilitated animals were released back into the wild. The premiere took place in the community center of nearby Gatlinburg, with proceeds benefiting the expansion of the Wildlife Center. Ruby was overwhelmed by the turnout, not just family and volunteers, but hundreds of community members whose lives had been touched by the center's work. Local school children who'd participated in educational programs, hikers who'd brought injured animals for care, and even some of the federal agents who'd investigated Calvin's trafficking network. As the documentary began, Ruby found herself watching not just her own story unfold, but the stories of everyone who'd become part of this unexpected community. She saw Margaret's transformation from grieving widow to confident bird specialist, James's journey from physical disability to innovative problem solver, and Sarah Beth's evolution from depressed retiree to dynamic educator. The film's climax came with footage of Hope's return, the moment when he emerged from the forest with his own family, approaching the edge of Ruby's property with the confidence of an animal who understood this place as sanctuary. The cameras captured Ruby's tears as she realized that her decision to fight for one injured cub had created a legacy that would outlive her by generations. "This is what healing looks like," Ruby said to the camera, as Hope's cubs played in the distance while their parents watched protectively. Not just the mending of broken bones or damaged hearts, but the creation of safety in a world that can be dangerous. When we choose to protect the vulnerable, we're not just saving them, we're saving part of ourselves. The documentary ended with a montage of success stories. Animals returned to the wild, volunteers finding new purpose, children like Tyler discovering hope in the midst of medical crises, and families like Ruby's own learning to value the wisdom and strength of their elderly members. As the credits rolled and the audience erupted in applause, Ruby felt Earl's presence as strongly as if he were sitting beside her. She could almost hear his voice saying what he'd told her countless times during their 43 years together. "Ruby May, your heart's too big for your own good." But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of what that oversized heart had accomplished, Ruby knew Earl had been wrong about one thing. Her heart wasn't too big. It was exactly the right size for the work she'd been called to do. At 76, with a rebuilt heart and a community of people who'd found their own second chances through wildlife rehabilitation, Ruby May Thompson understood the truth that had taken her 7 decades to learn. The most important journeys don't end when you get old. They begin when you finally understand that your experience, your compassion, and your determination to make a difference are gifts the world desperately needs. The little bear cub who'd tumbled from that torn canvas bag had saved more than his own life. He'd saved Ruby's understanding of what it meant to be alive, to be needed, to be exactly where God intended her to be. And in a forest clearing behind her cabin, Hope and his family settled down for the night, secure in the knowledge that some places in the world were protected by love that never retired, never gave up, and never stopped believing that healing was always possible. Ruby May Thompson's story was far from over. It was just reaching its most beautiful chapter.